Yeah, so my name's Brandon Poole. I'm here to kind of talk a little bit about SOC and things. A little bit quickly about my background is grew up IT generalist. Went from IT generalist straight into like security SOC work. That's where I've been here for probably the last 5 years. Done enterprise level, MSSP, MDR, et cetera, et cetera. So I've been in the trenches, kind of know what's going on. Corey, if you don't mind. So here's a question. Well, before you even ask this question, how many of you actually working with SOC currently? 1, 2, 3. How many people are interested in working in a SOC?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Here we go. We got some hand raises.
You need to hear your presentation first.
All right.
I'm
We've got to practice this in the room. So why do you need to why do you need to survive a SOC? Really and truly, it's headlines like this. I mean, these really don't look all that promising. I mean, 1 in 3 SOC analysts job hunting, burnout. I mean, whenever you look at the security industry as a whole, and you break it down based off job titles, security engineer, job roles, and stuff like that. SOC analysts have the highest burnout rate, in the whole infosec industry. And that's really because of the stuff they have to deal with. Alert fatigue, so just tons of alert always coming in. People, they care about this APT actor, so I'm gonna write a real quick rule, detect it, and it's crappy, tons of false positives. You just get overwhelmed, you get burned out, and that's really morale overall is very low in SOCs. And what I kind of want to do is teach you how to survive this. Make a career out of being in a SOC if you so desire it. So the key or the fundamental to working in a SOC is being able to do analysis, being able to determine, yes, this is a true positive versus this is a false positive. But what really is analysis? Anyone want to venture a guess? Bueller.
Sarcastic bastard in the back said analyzing things.
Oh! All right. Well, yeah, I guess it is analyzing things. Let's take a look at what Webster Dictionary says. Detailed examination of elements or structures of something. Doesn't really help me give me any close. So probably a better definition, or a definition we'll use, is just an alert comes in, and essentially what you're doing is you're trying to triage that alert, determine whether or not that alert is a true positive, false positive, gather context around that alert to make assumptions and determine how you should escalate that alert or what you should do with it. You really kind of do this by creating and applying models. So it's kind of like, middle school science in a way. There we go. Corey's a little delayed there on the clicker.
Yeah.
I'll forgive you this one time. I'll dock it from your pay. So, like I said, it's kind of like middle school science. It's very similar to the scientific method. And kind of like a general workflow here is, this right here. Essentially, and if you guys have any questions at any point in time, for those of you working in SOC or interested, feel free to just ask. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. So essentially, the basic analysis is you get an alert. The alert is essentially an observation. That alert could be user went to a domain with a malicious reputation. But based off that observation, you've now got to ask yourself a series of questions to determine whether or not it was actually a malicious domain. So for example, if you get an alert that says user went to a malicious domain, how would you analyze that? How would you determine whether or not that domain is actually truly malicious?
Check the internet.
Check the internet. So your question might be, who says it's malicious?
Is it actually malicious?
Yeah. So you might start with, go to your OSINT sources. So something like X-Force virus total. Who says it's malicious and what do they say about it? That could be your question. You want the virus total? It's collecting your data. Based off that data, you might say, I think this is malicious. You can come up with a hypothesis or another way to kind of test it, get some more information, eventually come to a conclusion on that question, wrap it back around to the next question. So you go to someplace like virus total, it says this domain is malicious, and there's this one binary with this MD5 hash that talks to it. So your next question might be, is there a binary with that hash on my system talking to this domain? And then from there, you collect the data. Well, let me get all the binaries on the boxes with the hashes, something like a sysmon or EDR tool. You can compare and kind of filter your way down, and eventually you keep asking yourself a serious question. You come to that determination whether or not, like, yes, this user has malware, this domain is the C2 beacon, or no, this user just went and decided they were going to type random stuff in Google, which happens.
Yay.
So as I said, it's a scientific method. We continue to refine, so question to question, question, blah, blah, and problem. So, as we said, you know, analysis is based off models, principles, axioms. So we're going to touch on some of the foundation principles that pretty much all of our analysis uses or takes place. So the first one is Locard's exchange principle. Who here has heard of Locard's exchange principle? Nobody. So this principle, someone want to venture like how old this is? Old. Yeah, so this is like, you know,
1693.
almost 200 years old.
Nobody's named Locard anymore.
Yes, that's very true. There's not very many people called Locard.
Next kid name, yeah.
So this actually is a foundation of forensic science in general. So essentially, what Locard said was anything that comes in contact with another thing leaves a trace. So if I walk into Corey's house, I've got dirt on my shoes. I'm gonna leave dirt behind in his house and piss him off. You know, if I go and decide I'm gonna take a baseball bat to Enrique's car, I'm gonna take some of the paint off his car and leave it on my baseball bat. So anytime, you know, if I go up and I shake your hand and I tell you I had the flu, the thing is that anything that interacts with another thing takes a piece of that thing and leaves a piece of itself with the thing that interacted with. And this here, like I said, it literally is like true for all forensics, whether it's, you know, digital forensics, actual, like, you know, CSI forensics. And so that's really one of the foundational pieces. So whenever you're analyzing things, just look quick there. I didn't actually mean for you to do that, but that's fine. So
quick gesturing to him.
Are you sure you want me to do this?
Corey is the worst.
I'll tell you what, why clap?
It's like
a
presentation.
Just, it's dead. It teaches me a lesson. I mean, a couple dollars could save me a whole lot of heartache.
Your presentation clicker was dead, so you hired a troll to fill it.
And the worst part is we're fighting.
He didn't look Russian. I mean, he didn't have an accent. So part of also, you know, doing analysis of being in SOC is also having like that fundamental like IT background. I'm kind of like on the fence whether or not SOC role is actually like an entry level job. It is always great for you to have like 2 or 3 years of help desk experience and just kind of understand how things work. So you can kind of understand like how these things work. For example, like, you know, if an IP address or if I plug a machine into your network, what artifacts do you think I'm going to leave behind in your network if I just walk into your enterprise network, plug a machine in? You want to venture a guess? You know, let's apply Locard's exchange principle here.
Minimum, you're going to leave DHCP, DNS logs.
Okay. What else am I going to leave?
MAC address.
MAC address?
Well, I was implying that DHCP, but sure. You're not wrong.
So I got a question. If I just walk over to Enrique's machine and just plug in a rubber ducky, what artifacts will I leave behind?
Depends on what country made the rubber.
So so whenever you plug like USB devices in and stuff like that, you're actually on Windows box like leaving registry entries with like a GUID and the hardware ID and stuff like that, so you can fingerprint who actually manufactured the device. So, you know, at a very fundamental level, you know, it's nice to kind of understand this stuff. Though knowledge is definitely power when it comes to analysis of software. So, like, learning is definitely a key. Hey, Occam's razor. Has everyone here heard of Occam's razor? Anyone want to like say what it means? And a lot of people usually get it wrong. But don't let that like keep you from saying. I mean, just speak up and let me make a fool of you. Just kidding. What was that?
Was that Harry Potter? No.
I don't believe so.
The simplest explanation is probably the right one. Yes.
Yes. So essentially what that says is that if you have two explanations with equal explanatory power, the one which the least amount of assumptions is made is usually the one you should prefer. So, if you ask me how a baby comes, I tell you this big long story about how a baby comes versus how a stork comes and brings a baby. Yes, the stork is definitely the simpler answer, but then there's all these other questions like where does the stork get the baby and stuff like that. So when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, there's a whole lot more assumptions with the stork there. So just a good example there. Same thing with like forensics. Like you come up with like some crazy story about like so-and-so hacked into this web server and then they pivoted over here. When they pivoted over here, they impersonated this guy to send an email, commit some betting to plug in this USB drive from the or it could just be that some guy just put a USB with malware on it in the parking lot in an envelope that said payroll data, dropped it, and Betty just picked it up and says, I wonder what Joe gets paid.
Or the head of finance plugs it in. I wonder whose drive this is so I can fire them.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now, there's also a slight derivative of Occam's razor that I want to point out because it's very important too. Halon's razor. Anyone heard of that?
Yes.
Yes. This is actually very, very popular, very, very common.
This is one of my favorite things of all time.
Yes. Never attribute to a malice, which that can't be explained equally by like stupidity. So you shouldn't think that some coworker of yours who did something dumb is out to like screw the company over. They probably just did something dumb.
And Hanlon's razor makes driving way less stressful. They're not being an asshole. They're just stupid enough to cut you off.
There you go. I like that. I'm gonna have to use that. So now we're gonna talk. So now we're gonna talk. Now we've talked about some of these fundamental principles. Now we're gonna talk kind of about the models we use. So the first model, Lockheed Martin kill chain. Everybody, sigh.
Look, man, I don't want to have to write a check to Lockheed Martin. Can we only say kill chain the once, twice now?
So, is there anyone not familiar with Lockheed Martin's kill chain in the room? All right, so to give you a little background, Lockheed Martin actually got a contract. They do a lot of work with the government, DOD. They got a contract very early on, like early 2000s. And what they did was they took all this military terminology, they took the military concept of a kill chain, they applied it to the cyber domain. And essentially what they did was they broke down the steps that an attacker or an adversary would have to do to get into your network. So there's this cool little graphic here. I don't know how well y'all can see it, but I'll kind of like read it out to you. So essentially stage one is doing recon. So I got to know what you have in your environment. I got to figure out you got Windows 7, Windows 10, Linux, what your IP addresses are and stuff like that. And there's multiple ways to do that. Scrape LinkedIn, phish you, call you up on the phone, pretend to be, a guy from Dell, like, hey, let me sell you this backup utility. What do you currently use? Yada, yada, yada. So doing recon, OSINT works just as well. Nmap, scanning your, IP range. The next step is once you've gathered enough like recon to kind of understand what's in the environment, what you're doing is you're weaponizing something. So that might be like a malicious Word doc with a macro. So you weaponize something. Once you've now got that macro in that Word document, you move on to the third step. You've got to deliver it to someone so they can do something with it. So you might attach it to an email, send it off. Fourth step, they open up the email, open up that Word document. Yes, I love macros. Bada bing, bada boom. PC spits out flames and I'm the spawn of Satan. Then from there, like it actually like installs some type of persistent mechanism. That way, if the user like reboots their machine, they're not gonna have to double click on that Word document again. Then you've got to be able to tell that what to do. So you got to have a command and control channel, some way to talk to that malware or some way to talk to that implant. And then that step 7 is action on objective. So whatever I want to do. So if I want to encrypt all your stuff with ransomware, if I want to steal all your R&D data, I'm going to do that. Very simple model. Lays out the basic structure of the task, as I've already said. It's really a high-level model. Like it's not going to get very granular or anything like that. Anyone want to take a guess on how we can apply this working in a SOC? We're going to touch on it a little bit more later on, but I want to see if anyone's got some ideas. A lot of people, you say Lockheed Martin, and it's more like kind of like you're trying to sell me something. Like what can I do with it?
I think you need to understand how the kill chain happens so that you can look for those indicators and things so that you can.
It at least lets you classify things you identified as one of these buckets so that you can start to organize what you found.
All right, so for example, let's say I have a snort roll. The snort roll comes back and says, talking to this IP address is talking to like a known Zeus C2 channel. I do the research. I confirm it's a known Zeus C2 channel. Zeus is a banking Trojan for those of you who don't know. So it steals all the credit card data that you enter in, type in, all your banking information. Essentially, once you've confirmed that, you can say, okay, this is command and control information. But the thing is, you want to backtrack that investigation. So you can use this model saying, okay, if I just block this IP address and they've still got other communication channels or the malware still in the box, like there's all this other bad stuff still in the network. So understanding like where an alert fits once you've like said that this is a true positive, walking back. So I know this is Zeus. Well, how's it staying persistent? So when I reboot my box, how's it restarting that binary? So I might want to find that out. That could easily be, just like, scheduled task. So it also helps you whenever you find like a true alert, walk it back to understand the whole chain of the intrusion. And that way you can actually contain and remediate. So a lot of what we see today, or a lot of what I see today, especially with things like Emotet, is they break it into multiple stages. So like you'll have like a maldoc, that maldoc will actually go through. It's like the movie Inception. It's a kill chain within a kill chain, which is real crazy. So you'd have something like Emotet, which is like a maldoc. It will like spawn like a pretty much like PowerShell. PowerShell download a binary. Launch that binary. Where that binary actually goes down and just grabs more malicious stuff and does the same thing where it's actually going and delivering it and exploiting it, and that's actually installing and setting up that. So what happens is you have multiple implants, and the reason they do this is for resiliency. So what happens is if you find like that Emotet and you kill it, guess what? I still have like another dropper on the box that's still peeking out. She didn't catch. So guess what? I just grab another version of Emotet and throw it on the box. Bada bing, bada boom. Then you got to wait for your AV to catch up or your threat feed to put this new domain on there. So it's real important to understand this and have this kind of concept in mind. That way you can kind of walk it back. Okay, Mandy attack lifecycle. So this is the better version of the kill chain, if you ask me. $, because it's a kill chain. You're welcome, Adam. Now, Mandy actually came up with this like.
I'm going to have to write a check to Lockheed Martin for more money than it cost me to put on this meeting.
More sponsors.
Maybe we can get Lockheed Martin to sponsor.
Maybe. So Mandy, which is now owned by FireEye, actually developed this with like their ATP1. So this model is slightly different than the kill chain in that if you notice, like there's a lot of stuff that's kind of like broken up. You still have a recon, but then they kind of push like that installation, that delivery, weaponization kind of to initial compromise and establish foothold. So certain things are kind of expanding, other things are kind of drawn on. But what's interesting is once they gain that like established foothold, they talk about wanting to escalate privileges, understanding the internal network, moving on to like laterally to another machine. So they kind of cover it from a different aspect. The nice thing about like the kill chain is the kill chain, can be applied to like a hands-on keyboard active adversary. It can be applied to something like ransomware. This here can really only be applied to like a hands-on keyboard adversary. So an actual actor that is not opportunistic. He's wanting to get in your network and try to find something in particular. He's trying to move around, dig in. So, if you have that feeling, this here's another model that you can kind of apply and try to understand what's going on. And as I said, this applies to most active intrusions. And by active, I mean like someone hands-on keyboard actively going through. So another model, MITRE attack. So how many of y'all were here for my last presentation back in January? How many of y'all remember what MITRE attack is or know what MITRE attack is?
I do.
Well, you said you did, so.
It's an attack framework. I don't know what you use it for.
Okay. So it is an attack framework. It is very kind of like meta. It's very high level. It maps to maybe the attack lifecycle, maps to like kill chain, but it maps in a completely different way and gets very granular on certain things. It's very focused on like TTPs more so, and it was actually designed for threat intelligence. So being able to take threat groups, saying they're using these techniques and trying to group people together to make that kind of stuff, it's very useful for that. And also testing like, hey, people are doing this weird thing with LSAS, like injecting threads into it. Who knows what that means? You inject a thread into LSAS. What does that mean? A guess. All right, so let's start with this. Anyone know what LSAS is?
Local security, something or other.
You know what it does?
It holds all your cache credentials.
It holds all your cache. So whenever you open like a thread, that means you're interacting with that process. You're talking to that process. You're doing something to that process. LSAS is what we call like a very secure process. Nothing should really talk or interface with it. It should talk to other things. So it's kind of like the cool kid. Like if it needs something, it'll come talk to you. You don't talk to it. But this here is like pretty much like Mimikatz, all of your credential tools. The number one way to do that is something like Sysmon or EDR tool. If you see it, actually go reach out and touch LSAS. 99% of the time is what they're doing. They're stealing all your passwords right out of LSAS. So kind of interesting thing there. So yeah, it's used more for TI and detection capabilities. But really and truly, it's a good idea of kind of like, we were talking on like the kill chain about establishing that persistence, like installing. What are ways that you can install? What are ways that you can have persistent? I said schedule tasks. Anyone else know any other persistent mechanisms? Startup scripts. What else?
Loading yourself as a service will be super obvious.
All right. What else? So what I'm getting at is eventually you guys are going to run out of things. But MITRE, what MITRE does is they went through like pretty much every single threat intelligence report that ever existed. And they have found every possible way that you can establish persistence. And you just go to this column that says persistence, and it says here are like 30 ways you can establish persistence. So if you go and you get like, that Zeus Trojan, and you say, well, how is it persistent? You can go pivot over to MITRE and say, okay, there's 30 ways that it can be persistent on Windows. Well, let me go and see if I got logs or data sources to see, if there's persistent mechanisms there. The other nice thing about MITRE is you can click on all those persistent mechanisms, and they will straight up tell you, if someone established a persistent mechanism like this, look at these logs or this data source. So they also kind of hold your hand a lot, so it's real nice. And on top of that, they also, to make your report writing very easy, they also have a mitigation. Like, hey, to stop people from doing this really bad stuff, do this. So it makes your report writing really easy as well. So like I said, it's real meta. It doesn't quite fit with what your everyday stock analyst would do. But it's a good starting place if you say, okay, if I'm trying to walk back and I don't understand everything that's possible, they pretty much listed everything that's possible for you. Pyramid of Pain. This is Dave Bianco's creation. I'm a big Pyramid of Pain person. I carry it, near and dear, it's close to my heart. Anyone know what Pyramid of Pain is? Other than a pyramid shape on the slide that says pain. It says things like annoying, simple. So
nice and colorful. It doesn't look very painful.
Oh no. So it's not painful for us blue teamers.
That TTP looks real painful.
Yeah. So it's actually not painful for us blue teamers. It actually goes through and talks about what's painful for the red teamers. So what it does is it talks about different indicators. So like a hash, an IP, a domain, a network host artifact, a tool, or a TTP, and how much pain it caused the adversary to change. So hash down here. It's easy to get a hash value. It's easy to use like certain tools to block hashes, EDR, stuff like that. It's easy to use YAR rules to detect these things and go in and manually do it. But how easy is it for someone to change a hash value? Super easy.
Bit, right?
What was that?
You change a bit, right?
Yeah, that's it. Like
Literally anything.
just add like a NOP, which is no operation assembly, to your binary. You completely change the hash.
I think the Verizon report last year said the average piece of malware's life is 358 seconds. What somebody has to do with that.
And that's one of the issues that you see right now with Emotet. Emotet is huge right now. If you don't know, like if you go and Google Emotet, like you can be reading for like years on it. So what makes Emotet really nasty right now is it uses SMB to kind of move laterally everywhere. And when it does that, it just randomly decides, it's polymorphic, it randomly decides to change itself. And it'll just write itself over and over and over again, each time with a different hash. And so a lot of the IR cases I work with customers with Emotet, like it's just everywhere. Like their AV will pick up and they'll be like, well, we got 80 like different strands of Emotet today. And it's like, well, you didn't catch the other 120. They're all over your environment. It's a good job. Usually the AV will get that 120 tomorrow, and then there's like another 160 it didn't get. So, hashes are really, really hard. But, IP addresses are, a little bit harder for an adversary to change, but it's still relatively easy. We're in the post-cloud era. We are in the cloud era. If you log into, anyone do anything with AWS, Google Cloud, anything like that, how easy is it to change an IP address?
But wait, are they changing your IP address, or are you trying to change your own?
You're trying. Well, I guess if you're the adversary, you're trying to change it.
Yeah, I don't like doing that. It's a pain in the ass.
Well, I guess it depends on the service as well. But most places, like it's just like a couple button clicks and bing, bada boom. Or you just kill the server you had and stand up a new server just like that.
If we can just kill the server. Yeah, see, I don't have those options. I'm on the other side. So there's like critical services, and if you move it, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, so like IP addresses, it's relatively easy to change an IP address. Now, domain names is simple. Anyone want to guess why domain names are a little bit harder to for adversaries to change than IP addresses? Not that it's unique. What was that?
You have to pay for them.
You have to pay for them. Oh my gosh, if I'm an adversary and you just block my domains, I've got to put in a credit card. And it's got to be anonymous, so it can't be tracked down with me when you report me. Or I get one of these free domains and I've got to do all the stuff and come up with an email so they can spam me later.
The solution is easy. Let's just kick over a registrar. It'll be fine.
So domain names are a little bit more painful. Now, when we get to network host-based artifacts, so these are really, really hard to change. These are usually your network and host-based artifacts are closely related to your tools. So certain tools have certain fingerprints, like Nmap scan. And Nmap scan, you'll always see something when you're doing like a send scan. You'll always see a send, an IMCP, time request. It's 3 packets that you see. It's real easy to fingerprint that. And that's what we call a network-based artifact. Now you can go in and you can still use the tool and you can change the order of those packets or change completely different packets and maybe get the same results and stuff like that. But let's be honest, our adversaries, our attackers, they're super lazy. I don't want to have to rewrite a tool. I'd just rather go download another tool. Which kind of gets to where we're at, tools. I think everybody in here worked in IT for a while. How hard is it to learn a new tool? Like a new ticketing system or some crazy server that you see.
Would you like me to be effective anytime in the next month?
Exactly. Retooling and understanding these new tools and where they suck and where they're great at. That takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of man hours. If you can detect the tool, something like Mimikatz or Invoke Mimikatz or Nmap or anything like that, and the only way they can get in is they have to ditch that tool and learn another tool. If they're lazy and they're just kind of opportunistic, they're just going to move on. They're not going to mess with you. Now, if they're dedicated and they really want to get in your network, they'll still put some work in, but they've got to put a lot of man hours in. And TTPs, that goes back to that MITRE ATT&CK stuff. So TTPs, understanding the different techniques, not necessarily tools, but much higher level. So understanding those and being able to detect and block on those are very hard for us to do as well as a blue team, but it makes it extremely difficult on their side as well. Tactic, technique, and procedure.
So if you see they come in through this mechanism, then switch to this mechanism once they've gained control of the box, then do this. It's really hard for a team to completely retool so they don't do that again, right?
Okay.
That's a strong indicator that the same team is doing the same thing to a different company.
Or that's your tattoo kind of that.
This is how they go through and identify Russian hackers versus Korean hackers versus.
The perfect way to do it is how many of you guys have had an SOP, did something the same way for 5 years, management changed, they changed the SOP, then you call them to the boss's office and tell you to bend over the desk and then they spank you because you didn't follow the policy.
Yeah.
Same thing here.
The spanking is also part of policy.
Same thing here. Now, this model actually is most useful whenever we're trying to determine containment and remediation. So if we get an alert, we determine it's true and stuff like that, and you're trying to determine how to properly contain this, how to remediate this and stuff like that, you kind of want to keep this in mind as far as putting those containment controls in place. Like, you know, if it's just going out and you saying, hey, I've got this one hash talking to this malicious IP, I'm going to block this hash and IP, and you didn't really look into domain names, they could have a bunch of different hashes compiled differently, like Emotet, all talking to the same domain name, and you block an IP address. That domain name can be round robin with DNS, and you've just completely busted your containment, and now they're still just moving through your network. So this here's kind of a model to kind of apply and kind of understand, you know, kind of where we're, you know, how we want to stop things, how we want to control things. The skills. We're going to talk about having mad skills now, SOC analysts. Triaging. So why is triaging important? So then we talk about you guys get tons of alerts, like it's like a waterfall, it just floods you.
Figure out what's important.
Figure out what's important, yep. Yep. So how do you, so let's say that, you know, I hire you day one, you're in a SOC, I've got a completely untuned SIM. For those of you, what was that?
I'm not wearing any socks.
Well, you have no problem then. You know, you get hired, completely untuned SIM. I sit you down, it's like, work these alerts. The SIM has like, you know, some crappy arbitrarily like mechanism for trying to triage things and tell you, but it's all over the place. Like, how would you work these events? What's a way to work them? Anyone want to venture a guess?
Like common IP.
Think a little bit more meta. So then let's think back to our models. So we had some models and stuff like that. Let's think back to the kill chain. So if I got an alert that fires on like someone just scanning like my web server versus, oh shit, there's malware in my environment. Which one do you think we want to like look at first? Malware. So like one of the ways. Sorry, Corey.
I don't know how many of them there are. If I click too much, it goes away.
I don't think there's any more. We'll find out in a minute. So like one of the ways you can do it is you can apply like some of these models, like the kill chain, the many attack cycle and stuff like that. And you can kind of go through and you can say something like, actually I do think there's one more. There we go.
One more?
Yep. So attack life cycle, so mapping these things, so things that are like further along in the attack life cycle, definitely are things you should work more. The other thing is conversion rate. Are any of y'all familiar with conversion rate? This is something that I don't really see a whole lot in like new SOCs or immature SOCs, or people trying to like, you know, get their feet wet. So ideally in your SOC, you know, you got your SIM, you got your whatever is doing all the alerts, and then you've got your case management utility. And ideally those two should be integrated. And what happens is whenever alert fires, it opens up a case, you go through the case, you investigate, determine whether or not it's false positive, you can close as false positive or true positive. So one of the cool things you can do is if that integration is tight, you can feed that data back in there. So conversion rate is essentially the number of times something is marked and determined to be a true positive over the number of times that fires. So if I have a crappy rule that, you know, has one true positive and fires like 1,000 times, what I can do is I can say, this is probably a false positive, put this at the very bottom of the barrel. Let me take the more unique or rarer events that, you know, have a better like conversion rate so they actually convert to something malicious or suspicious and work those first. And then we have what we call like alert stacking. So this kind of goes right back with like conversion rates. So usually what happens is if you have a rule that's a false positive, usually they're very noisy, right? So anybody work with like Snort, Suricata, any of the IDSs? Those are pretty noisy, especially the pre-processor rules. They're like super noisy. So one of the things we can do is we call it like alert stacking. So we can take an alert and say, okay, let me go and let me stack the alerts. How many times this alert occurs? So you have one alert that occurs 100 times. You've got one that occurs like 75, one that occurs like 50 times. So what you do is you stack them, and you actually work from the lowest number to the highest number with the idea that the one that's most false positive prone is the one that's the most noisiest, and you just kind of work that one last. So that's kind of like a poor man's way of doing like conversion. And you can actually do alert stacking. What's that?
Does alert stacking not always mean that you never work the most noisy alerts? I mean, in my practical experience, those are the ones we never got to.
So yes, that is correct. The idea is, okay. So I didn't. So this is actually like kind of like a I was actually designing like a training course at one point in time, like train people to be a SOC analyst. It was like 5 days long. This presentation is kind of like very meta, very high level.
I was gonna say you just distilled 5 days worth of.
Yeah, and I try to keep it high level because I don't know everybody's background. Like I don't have time to like teach you guys like packet capture analysis 101. I just kind of want to give you guys like some fundamental like knowledge and ideas. But the idea is that yes, that is very true. Like if you have like a very noisy rule, you'll never get around to it. But it's one of those things that has anyone ever read like Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow? That book? So it's a great book. They talk about like different modes of thinking. So you've got what you call your system one thinking and your system two thinking. System one thinking is kind of like just like very quick, like anecdotal experience. Like, hey, this IP address always fires this alert, and I know that it always fires this alert. It's probably a false positive, so I'm just gonna close it and not look at it. So when it comes to like working in a SOC, you don't want to have like system one thinking, because system one thinking is usually how you like miss something. System two thinking is more kind of like, you know, this unique. I don't see it a whole lot more. I don't have like a cognitive bias that's going to like lead me to a conclusion. So the idea by stacking it that way is the more unique events you're actually working, you're keeping the analyst in that like type two things, and they're also the higher probability to be abnormalities in your environment, more likely to be malicious. So you're kind of keeping that system two thing instead of just making like an assumption and actually missing something. And this kind of goes into like really more detection theory than actually working in a SOC. But the idea behind detection theory is you don't have to detect everything. The thing is, like, it is perfectly okay to say, I can't detect like these 10 things, but I can detect these things around it. So the idea is like going back to MITRE, I can just say, I can't detect any persistent mechanism. Like you get on my box and you do something persistent, I have no idea what you do because I don't have the logs or anything like that. But if I can detect every way you can install this stuff, and then every way that you can move laterally in the environment, you installing a persistent mechanism to start up and startup every time does nothing, because that's all you can do without getting caught. So it kind of also goes into that. Like there's certain things that you just accept the risk on. Like you just say, this is going to be noisy, I'm going to miss things.
Keep on over here so you can see over here.
That's right. Essentially what you're doing is you're saying that this is more than likely noise, I'm going to throw it away. But in the ideal world, you should probably also have like some higher level analysts or like some people actually going through and trying to tune that stuff. Or if like they can't really tune it well, you just pretty much say, okay, can I break this rule into like smaller rules that are easier to tune or maintain? Or if it's just generating a lot of noise and wasting a lot of man hours, just turn it off.
Yeah.
Because more than likely you're not spending any time like doing the analysis work anyways, or giving it the attention and care that it needs to actually investigate. So
if the alert just cries wolf and you just ignore it.
That ended up being our strategy for attacking it, was pay attention to the alert that's never fired before, because the hell is this? This is interesting.
This is new and shiny and fun.
And then the one that fires 47 times every millisecond, we just turned that one off because.
I mean, in an ideal world, like you'd want to tune that where maybe it only fires like 20 times every hour or something like that.
Sure.
But the thing is, once again, like there's definitely like a security shortage and a skill set shortage. And sometimes it's not even that. Like you've got like all the staff in place, you just don't have like the data sources to like enrich it and to pivot and to actually like do that tuning. So I mean, that once again is one of those things where you have to accept that risk.
Yeah.
So, cool. Are there any other questions?
I want to touch on how you mentioned up there how the IDS and SIMs provide priority. That really means nothing. Threat intel can also be the same, where if you're just sitting on a wall, you're chasing out nothing as well.
So hypercritical ultra death alert. Yeah, that is ultimately someone clicked the link.
Yeah, or just an old IP that came from AWS.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely have issues with threat intelligence, because most threat intelligence feeds, in my opinion, is just utter crap. Because I've gotten threat intelligence feeds before where they're just kind of like, they read an immediate report, pull out all the hashes, IP addresses, and then shove it in the list, and they charge you for it. And then you're like, someone being proactive is like, I'm gonna block all these hashes because it's all malware, right? And the next thing you know, like they block like Microsoft Word in your environment, which has actually happened. Or they'll like block something like Chrome, which has actually happened. Or in one case,
there was that one time that Kaspersky blocked like one of the core Windows system files, and it was like there was like Patch Tuesday happened, and then the next morning it was like Windows 7 apocalypse. All of the Windows 7 machines would boot up and just hourglass, not for like 10 minutes, for like 4 hours. Most machines didn't start until after lunch.
So here's another good example. In the CrowdStrike report, because they worked the whole DNC hack, some of the indicators that came out of that and made it into the threat intelligence list was like Yahoo. Which let's be honest, like if you really block Yahoo, like I don't think it's gonna really affect much of anybody. Maybe your grandmother who hasn't migrated from Yahoo Mail, but she's not in an enterprise environment.
Don't underestimate my grandma.
So I mean,
My grandma's all up in your enterprise environment.
So bonus tip. I'm gonna give you my opinion on threat intelligence feed. Don't feed a threat intelligence feed, please, into your IDS or SIM to generate alerts, because a lot of, like 99% of the time, the data's crap and there's no context there. Like intelligence assumes that there's data and you have linked all these connections to this data. Like the data actually makes sense together. When they sell you a threat intelligence feed, they have removed all the intelligence and it's just raw data. You have no idea what the meaning is. What you do is you overwhelm like your SOC analyst. Like if you're going to buy a threat intelligence feed, don't alert on it. Just use that feed when you generate an alert to actually do a lookup, and then use that to kind of add like context. Like I had this alert that fired, on this, and Kaspersky came out and said, "Oh, this is actually a malware we found 2 weeks ago being used by like this crime organization." And you're like, "Oh, cool!" And you can actually use it for something.
It should be like Interpol, where you're looking at something, you go, "Hey, Interpol, is this a thing or is this not a thing?"
Yeah, the problem with threat intelligence feed is it's kind of like, I'm just gonna walk up to someone and just arrest them because like someone out in the parking lot told me that, you broke it and like robbed the liquor store a couple weeks ago. You look kind of like a steer set. You don't have the context, you weren't there, you can't make a determination whether or not it's malicious.
Before we move on, this is possibly the greatest meme that's ever been on any slide in any bulletin. Just wanted to say that.
I
Nicely done.
Yes. I had to go through all my dank memes to find this. Researching, aka Google Food. So this is probably, in my opinion, is like the most important skill. And the reason why is because like context. So if alert fires and I want to like understand like the contents around this, like using OSINT, going to something like VirusTotal, going to something like Xforce, going to something like domain tools, using who is, stuff like that to gather kind of context and stuff like that around the event. Another thing that unfortunately GDPR broke my heart, but it used to be you could do something like if you had a subscription domain tools, you could actually go in and be like, all right, this domain associated with this malware, pop it in there. You get the email address that was registered to, they didn't pay for privacy guard, pivot all that, see all the other domains they've registered, see if any of those domains, and that was like an awesome way to find all kind of malware that necessarily hadn't made it onto like a threat feed or someone hasn't researched or found out anything about. The other big one is WTF, what is this alert? So I know if you, sir, said you worked a lot with Sericon and Snort. How many times have you seen a Sericon or IDS alert or something like that, and like WTF, what's it asking for?
Plenty of times.
Yes.
Yeah, just the event itself doesn't help.
Yeah. So like, I'm gonna hate a little bit here.
60% of them say compromise.
Yeah. So I'm gonna hate a little bit here on like ET Pro or ET rules. So the emerging threat rules. So the emerging threat rules are like a free rule set for like Snort or Sericon you can like load in. The problem I have with it is if any of you guys are interested in getting to IDS, like this is the way to do it. Like emerging threat is like the way to go because they'll actually sit down. There's folks there that will actually help you like learn to write like IDS rules for Snort and stuff like that. But this here's kind of also the problem with it is that someone will walk you through and be like, hey, we need to detect this thing. Here's kind of how you write the rule. They give you a little bit of guidance. You write the rule. You write it with like a bad regex, or you don't write it with a very good description. It gets published there. It gets sent up. Everyone downloads it, and it generates like tons of noise. Now, that's great because you learn how to like write a rule and stuff like that, and I highly encourage you to actually do it. But sometimes it creates heartache for folks like me, just because. And yeah, ET Pro rule like names are like terrible because usually it's like ET Pro, and then it's got like info or emerging threats or malware or some tag, and then like a 2 or 3 word description, and you're like, what's going on here? And then sometimes you can go to the emerging threat like website and get some more information. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes they decide that, hey, this malware thing's really not malware. We're going to change it to informational, not really tell you. They also have these priorities in there, and the priorities sometimes are like set for like malware. So it'll have like a high priority one with malware. And the reason I bring this up because I saw this the other day. And then they changed the informational, and then they never changed the priority on it. So if you're doing anything with your sim with that priority, like you have this informational one way at the top over all the rest of them. So it's kind of a mess, but the same thing holds true for a lot of sim rules and stuff like that. A lot of sim rules, like they just have, a lot of times a developer a security guy goes to the developer, says, detect this thing. Developer doesn't know anything about security, writes a rule for it, like does some Googling, throws like, synergy and some other keywords up in there, buzzwords, like security buzzwords, the rule fires, and then you're like, what's going on here? Usually with a little bit of Google foo, like you can kind of find, like figure out what they're trying to detect and stuff like that. And once you understand kind of what that rule's like looking for, you can kind of pivot from there.
I think there needs to be a Suricata add-on, maybe an add-on for all of the platforms that just does an auto replace for like where it's like compromise, you just panic. Panic.
Yeah, so I know
security buzzword, just panic.
Yeah, so I know at one point in time, Doug Burt's creator of Security Onion also like puts on the big like B-Sides Augusta.
Yep.
I know he used to like teach people. So he taught like the 503 class for SANS for a while until like he just like finally got like heartbroken one day because like some guy from management came in. You ever meet him? He'll tell you this long story about the guy who never worked IT in his life. Like came in and took like this how to read packets and hex, and it was just too much for him. So he doesn't teach anymore, but he does teach like Security Onion like training classes. But he actually recommends with like Snort and Suricata rules and stuff like that. Pretty much like just turn on the ones that say malware to start with, and just work those. Because those are where your bang for the buck is. And then, once you get good at that stuff and you get processes down, maybe turn on some of the other ones. Once you get following that kill chain, work your way down.
Why does it just start with this on?
So, anyways, pivoting. So what is pivoting? Pivoting is like literally just like being to abstract things away and figure out their relationships. So, for example, if I say, hey, I've got this like IP address out on the internet and I think it's bad. What's a way that we can kind of like pivot to get more information? Let's say I'm stuck. So what's related to IP addresses?
Domain names.
Domain names. How are domain names related to IP addresses?
Magic.
Witchcraft. What do we do with the witches? We burn them. So no, like, pretty much like there's like this DNS server out there because I can't remember IP addresses, especially if it's IPv6, because there's nothing like remembering just tons of random hex characters. So, it takes this IP address and, I can't remember it. So there's a server out there that I can talk to and I can just remember like a couple words and smash together and it turns that into the IP address and tell me where I need to go. So yeah. So the thing is, if I'm stuck on an IP address, I can go and I can pivot over and I can look at domain names that's related to it and see how those are related. See if any of those domains are related to that IP address. What are some other things that I can kind of relate or pivot from IP address? Location. So there's geolocation. So I can kind of, hey, if it's talking to Russia and I don't do business in Russia, I might be a little concerned. What else is some other pivoting? So that's geolocation. So what uses an IP address to talk? Computers, but more specifically, what's on that computer?
Operating systems, user agents, I don't know.
Higher up in the operating system. What runs on the operating system? What is Microsoft Word? An application. So the application, if it needs to like get data from somewhere, it's got to talk on the network. So like, how would I map that application to like an IP address?
Port number.
Port number. All right. How would I get that port number?
The OS assigns it.
OS assigns it. Maybe that application listens on it. Maybe I just go and I don't know what I'm doing. I just type in Netstat and just give me the IP addresses and the ports it's listening on and what's talking to. That's another thing. In the application, what's some attributes of an application? Once I get to the application, where can I pivot?
What is it? What is it doing? What is it supposed to do?
So like you can get like hash from an application. So here's another fun thing that's really fun for detection that most people kind of ignore. So there's this like metadata field that's called internal name. So what it is, whenever you compile a piece of software, you give it an internal name, which is just the metadata. You usually don't see it, and so you can actually name something like malware. But that internal name is still there, even if you change the actual file name. So there's actually been cases where I've worked on like malware where people had the internal name where they can like compile it as test malware, and they ship it out that way. So, it actually infect people. The other thing is, are you guys familiar with sticky keys?
Did you just say configure? Configure? Somebody just say that? No? Okay.
Anyone familiar with sticky keys? Sticky key bypass?
Yes.
So for those of you that aren't familiar with like sticky keys or really any of these like accessibility bypasses, what some sysadmins do that really kind of like make me mad as a security person.
Tell me about it.
Is
Sit at this table.
Shut down the system.
Is they will take like something like command.exe, copy it, rename it to something like, magnifier, overwrite the actual magnifier password, and when I go to log into a server and I can't remember the password to like log in, I just go to accessibility, I can't see well, magnifier, boom, command shell system, full access to reset my password, do anything else, and no logging capability. But that's a good way to also detect that. It's like you can actually with certain EDR tools like look at internal names. So you just look for like whenever something says it's magnifier or magnifier.exe, but the command like internal name says it's command prompt, bada bing, bada boom, fire. So just an interesting way to do that. But anyway, so like understanding how things work together. What else is like related to like IP addresses, MAC addresses? So I can go down to layer 2 and stuff like that. So it's understanding like where I can pivot from and stuff like that, and also kind of understanding like how far away something is. So if I've got a device and the device is infected, and I give you an IP address, and I say, Adam, I've got this IP address that's malicious. I need you to find the device. How would you do it?
Like in my network?
In your network.
Put the sneakers on.
I just give you an IP address. I don't know anything. It's just an IP address.
Trace, look at ARP logs and switches.
Not the way I wanted you to go.
I'm sorry.
So most people.
Sorry, my telepathy is off today.
Yeah. So most people you like say that, hey, I've got this device.
You're talking to a network engineer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So most people you say, I've got this like malicious device in your network. This is the IP address I think it's on. What they'll do is they'll just do like a reverse lookup. So NS lookup on this IP address to host name, and they'll be like, well, this is the device that's infected. But the problem is like, once again, it goes back to like these abstractions. An IP address is like what we say 2 layers away from the actual device. The device has a MAC address. That MAC address is actually what's used to kind of assign the IP address. And then there's also DHCP in there. So the problem is what happens is that DHCP lease expired, and it handed the IP address to another device and used to do the NS lookup on it. And now I've grabbed the wrong machine. That malicious device is still in your network. So understanding how these things also interrelate also can tell you kind of like what other things you need to detect. So if you get an alert on the device, especially like over the weekend, let's just say that you don't run like a 24-hour like shop and you're just like, I'll get to it Monday. You get to it on Monday, the lease has changed, you grab the wrong thing, that bad box, that evil is still in your network. So it's one of those things also to kind of keep in mind with like pivoting and understanding how this data works. But essentially, like what pivoting comes down to is just understanding how everything's connected and just being able to kind of dance around, prevent yourself from getting stuck in an investigation.
Can you not also sidestep that by just maintaining really good logs on which IP addresses were handed out to which MAC address at which time?
So you could, but what if I tell you that it's talking to a malicious IP address not in your network and you don't have those logs? Or what happens if I tell you? What happens if I tell you?
Just saying. I'm just talking about which logs we should collect.
That's a whole different talk. If you're interested,
I'm sorry. Ignore me.
Yeah, so it's all about having like these like pivots and stuff like that. So some of my favorite pivots is for those of you who are Windows environments, which I think is just about everybody. Mm-hmm. Like just set up group policy where you turn Windows Firewall on, but you don't block anything. You set everything in audit mode. And this here is like an amazing thing for you to do. Because if I just say, hey, I've got this IP address talking on this source port to like this destination port, and I think this destination port is malicious. If you turn on those Windows Firewall like audit logs, I'm not blocking things. Like essentially it's still off. those Windows firewall logs will actually say, this program talked at this time on this source port to this destination port, and it lets you get that insight into the host. And then once you get that insight into the host, you can also then kind of like step it back without doing hardcore forensics. Well, what process kicked this process off? What's the other context around it? So that's a good pivot. Other good pivot, of course, is like IP address, domain name, DHCP logs, once again. So taking like an IP address and correlating to a domain name and the time that that IP address was given to that device. There's also a MAC address in there, so you can kind of correlate it. So fun stuff. So, yep. So use to avoid getting stuck. Build out a nice timeline on what happened. Pivoting, like I said, pretty major skill. Big key here is don't pivot too much. I see a lot of like new analysts do this.
Hi.
For those of you who are online, Adam just waved his hand and just outed himself as someone who pivots too much. So I've also seen analysts that pivot too much. Like they will like get an IP address, and from the IP address they'll pivot to a domain name. And then what happens is they'll say, well, that domain name is just, it's on GoDaddy, so it's a hosting provider. But there's all these other domain names that's on there. So I'm looking at these other domains, their names that are on there. So I pivot and didn't really like put any context into that. So what happens? I pivot to another domain name, which pivots to another IP address, which then like pivots to something else. So the other thing is, has everyone here heard of like IBM Watson? Big machine intelligence thing. So IBM also has a SIM, QRadar. I think a lot of you state folks, if there's anything in there, probably are way too familiar with that. That's what the state uses for their SIM. But IBM has like a plugin for QRadar that's called like Watson Security. It uses IBM Watson, great Jeopardy winner, to like determine and find all the malicious stuff in your network. And this is the problem Watson has. So you tell Watson, hey, I got this alert with this IP address, like, pivot and give me all the data. And like Watson just shows you like this big graph of like the whole internet. It's like, say this IP address talk to this IP address, talk to this IP address, belongs to this domain, which actually was on this IP address. It was actually had this hash, and this hash was seeing this email address that was sent to this person, and this person to this IP address. And what you do is, it just looks like a Maltego map just went crazy. Like it takes like 30 minutes to get up. Like it's just like colored dots everywhere, and you're just like, wow. Like Watson didn't help me at all. So, like I said, so be careful with your pivoting. Make sure that you pivot. Make sure that when you pivot with a purpose. Like, don't just pivot for like the hell of it. Don't pivot to pivot. Like, pivot to actually get data that you actually need to answer that question. Once again, going back to it, question, gather the data, like come up with a hypothesis, gather the data, test it, and then use that to ask another question. Going back to that scientific method. Don't collect data. A lot of digital forensic people say this, like there's never such thing as like too much data. That's partially true. There's like having too much data that you can't sort through or make sense of. So like I said, pivot with purpose. Scoping. So this is like a big tool as well, especially once you've determined something's malicious, is once you've confirmed an alert, like I get a phishing email, this phishing email is from this one address, do you just say, delete this email address from this one user and go about your day? Who thinks that's the right decision? Who thinks that's the wrong decision? We have 2 folks still away.
Yay.
Yeah. So
I'm surprised you didn't get like 3 new slides on clapping.
I'm surprised.
Still late, it'll happen.
Yeah. So once you've confirmed something is malicious and you pivoted over from that IP address to that domain address, once again going back to like you can round robin domain names. So it might be helpful to like scope and see how many assets actually talk. Hold on. Don't move. How many like other machines talk to that domain name, and when they're talking to that domain name, if it's the same IP address. So like take some of these like indicators that you generated whenever you pivot and actually look and see like what's the scope of this? Like is there 100 machines talking to it? Or is it just this one machine talking to it? Or is there 6 of them that for some reason the alert didn't fire on? Our tools don't always work right, unfortunately. So being able to go and like scope stuff, scoping like it's a huge deal once you've confirmed it and you're trying to contain or remediate. Like it doesn't do much like use if it's 50 machines and you just unplug the one machine. So like I said, scope based off like multiple IOCs, so kind of treat them independently and see what comes up and then kind of look at the difference. And that's also a good way to determine whether or not your IOC is a legitimate IOC or just noise. Checking your biases. So this year's fun. I actually do a whole presentation on this as well. So a bias is pretty much an error in how we think. We're programmed as humans to make certain assumptions, think certain ways to make this task of our life easier, help us survive essentially. So the big ones that we see for SOC work, you can just Google cognitive biases and you can come up with this big map here and read all about them. But the big one is clustering illusion, which is pretty much where you say all these things are grouped together. So I've got this one IP address and this one IP address is seen everywhere. Once again, kind of go back to the scoping, talking to all these boxes in my network, it has to be evil. Well, if you don't have any kind of context around it, or you don't check that bias, and you find out it's actually the domain controller, probably don't want to do anything with that. So
all the DNS commit requests going to that box.
Yeah, so understanding that just because something's grouped together doesn't necessarily mean that it's all related. Correlation, causality, the whole thing. The other one is confirmation bias. So this kind of, I used to have the slide with the airplane. Have all of y'all seen that? It's been going around LinkedIn and Twitter lately. So during World War II, there was yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So for those of you who haven't seen it, there's a picture of an airplane during World War II. The British were doing a study on where they needed to reinforce airplanes because they kept getting shot down on the way back over from Germany. And a statistician came out and says, we need to reinforce these 3 places. And it was 3 places where there were no bullet holes. And the British government said, man, you're crazy. I don't even know how you got on this commission. What he pointed out was it was pretty much confirmation of survivorship bias. And what happened was the planes that were getting shot in all these other places were the ones that were actually making it. The ones that were getting shot down that we were interested in are missing. And that's probably where they're getting
shot. The ones
shot.
that had bullet holes in these blank spots, they're the ones that are on the fields in Europe.
So there's that confirmation bias, thinking that you already know the answer, and just letting that belief that you already know the answer or where this investigation is going bias your opinion. This also kind of falls into what we call anecdotal bias. So there's another name for anecdotal bias. Does anyone want to venture a guess at what it is? Code experience. I kid you not.
That thing we hire for?
Yes.
Yeah.
10 years minimum.
Right. With Windows 2019.
So perfect example, if I say every time I come to ColaSec, Adam heckles me, my anecdotal bias tells me that anytime we're around Adam, he's gonna heckle me. But maybe if he's outside ColaSec, or maybe if his boss is in the room, he probably might not.
That's a good example because that's actually true.
So the thing is, once again, our experience, what we've seen over and over and over again, it's kind of you never learned the game of chess and you watch 2 people play chess. You could eventually figure out the moves, but the first time someone makes a move that you've never seen before, you'd be against the rules, man. That's not the way we play. And they're gonna
flipping the table. What is this?
Well, and then they can come back and be well, actually, it's not against the rules. How many games? You're I watched 6 games of chess. I got all this experience. And once again, you're letting your observations, your experience bias, and that experience, the way you see, you may not observe all the conditions that influence that. So that can also lead you kind of to a bad decision. It goes back to that system 1, system 2 thinking. We've got a rule that's really noisy, creates a lot of false positives and stuff like that. And I say, this is probably a false positive. I'm going to close it. That's going to be the one time that you're going to have an actual RGE, resume generating event, and it's going to be something bad, and you will be updating your resume and looking for employment somewhere else. Which is once again why we don't like SOC analysts in that system 1 type thinking. We want to tune or just turn off those rules, and when we turn off that rules, we want to build up coverage in other places to compensate for that. So I still had a couple more, but that's fine. So the other thing is availability bias. This goes back and kind of also touches on the plane and stuff like that. So you just make your decisions based off the data that you have available. You don't think about saying, hey, I don't have these logs. You just say, I have these logs, so this must be what happens because I don't have this other data. But you're not keeping in mind that there's other data that you could have or might not have that would completely change the course where you're going. Then anchoring bias, that's pretty much like the first piece of data that comes in, like you just anchor on it and you just assume that's true and you kind of anchor to it and you let that bias your whole investigation. You keep coming back and saying, well, it fired on this like Zeus malware with IP address while I was doing it. Like it's not related to Zeus, but I still think it's Zeus. And what happens is you like completely totally miss, like someone just misidentified like a command and control channel and you just completely whiffle like some malware that's still in your environment and stuff like that. So be careful of anchoring bias. Like I said, you can Google this stuff. This is a great thing. There's some other things out there that actually have like questions and stuff like that when you're actually doing analysis that you can ask yourself when you're working through and be like, okay, did you check this or have you thought about this to kind of like keep these biases in check? So once again, going back to that Google food skill. So let's quickly wrap up tonight because it is starting to get late. Let's put it all together and let's look at these 2 alerts here. So I got 2 alerts here. Let's put it all together. Like let's start off with, let's say I've got these 2 alerts. Which one should I work first and why? Think back to our models and all the other good stuff that we use tonight. Can y'all read them?
No, not really.
So the first one is snort alert bank loader from scraper callback. The other one is email detection appliance alert, potential mal spam received, confidence medium. And then there's some timestamps and some IP addresses and some other stuff. Which of those 2 would you guys work first?
Top one.
Why?
You can see details on like connection established. It's going out to an external. It's outbound connection, so that's kind of more learning to me. Also,
so let's just say I didn't give you any of this data. Somebody shows you this top thing. I just told you.
So it's just by title.
Yeah, it's just my title.
It's callback.
It's callback. What's callback?
Something inside has been told to reach out on an interval.
So thinking back to our models, what model could you use for this? Command and control, I heard it. Who said it? This man right here. All right. So command and control. The other one, where it's saying the potential mal spam received, where does that fall? That same model, Lockheed Martin kill chain. Delivery. So delivery versus C2. Which one should I work first? C2. Now, what if I told you that I had like, 1,000 of these C2 ones and like one of these like email ones? Would that change your opinion?
Yes. Probably C2 still.
Probably C2 still?
That's pretty good. 1,000 callbacks.
No, maybe that's a bad example.
It's almost too late before.
1,000 callbacks. You might as well just burn it all down. Start over. RGE. Yeah, RGE. You're already screwed. Yeah, so like if one was a lot more noisier than the other, like you would want to maybe look at that rare event too. Once again, this is kind of more like also understanding your organization and the risk aversity, and also understanding what you see in your environment. If I told you that this bank loader from callback scraper actually was like looking at like the public interface on your firewall, would you be as concerned? Like it's just like someone putting like a busted cider into it or something. So some other things. So all right, so we decided that we want to work this callback scraper first. So Enrique pointed out I've got a source IP address 10.1.1.5, destination IP address of 8.9.1.2, and then I've got some information here about like it's looking for an HTTP established, and it's looking for a GET, and it's got like this URI, so like the last part of the URL. So what would be some things you guys would like use to like investigate, or how would y'all pivot, or models that y'all would apply, et cetera, et cetera? How would you confirm whether or not this was evil?
Oh, well, since the easiest thing is to look at the destination IP and kind of get some reputation out of that.
So reputation, all right. So we'll pivot over to like an OSINT. So it comes back and it says it's kind of hit or miss. It's kind of, it looks like it was malicious like 6 months ago. Now where would you go? Where would you pivot? I got ports.
I check the internal box, make sure, see what it's supposed to do on a normal basis.
So baselining, all right. So that's something we didn't really cover, but yeah, you can totally baseline a system, understand like what's normal in that system, and whatnot.
How many connections to the IP from other parts of the organization?
Okay.
Could be like a proprietary software that they have set up to do that type of callback, and it just.
So you pivot from the IP address back to like that host on that box, and then look at firewall logs or something on that box to see the
Maybe like
process.
a perimeter firewall, see if you have like 2,000 endpoints all doing the same thing, then it may be by design. It may be. I mean, I've seen software that on install it goes out and downloads. An executable from a random IP address hosted by a third party. You call the vendor and they say, yeah, that's in our install package.
So yeah, that's completely valid. Yeah, if you saw 2,000 endpoints, like either you're completely and totally screwed,
Yeah,
or it's probably normal.
Yeah.
Like usually whenever you see like 80% of your endpoints all doing the same thing, it's one or two things. It's I need to like start calling, setting up some interviews, or it's probably
This goes back to the filtering thing, where like if it's all of your endpoints, you can probably ignore it.
crap. So
Or ignore the enemy flag.
I mean, so if it's all of your endpoints, even if you dive on it, like at that point, it's the grenade on the ground.
So it's one of those things that once again, like you can kind of as we point out, you can pivot to actual application that's on that box, and you can talk to the vendor whether or not that's normal. I mean, you can also pivot to that IP address, and you can actually see like who owns it. Like let's say we say who owns it. So 8.9, anyone familiar with that? Who owns the IP address? That's in the Google CIDR range.
It is Google.
Yeah, that whole like 8.0.0.0/8 CIDR is all Google. So, I mean, Google could have malware. Going back to like threats intelligence feed, like I've just about seen like the vast majority of threat intelligence feed, like 8.8.8.8, which is Google DNS server, being malicious or being used to like by malware to actually look up a domain.
Yeah, .microsoft.com has hundreds of Azure sites that people are hosting that are malicious.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one. It's just some of these things you can do. I've got this like URI here. Like I said, I mean, I can pivot off that, right? You can't see it, but it's like they're going to like some domain /temp/test/available PHP something.
Okay.
Another. So you can once again do some OSINT on that, maybe track back and say, okay, well this is related to like this certain type of a scraper. Anyone know what a scraper is?
Yeah, that crawls the web and pulls down data off of sites.
So
Sometimes it's targeted, sometimes it's not.
So no, I'm gonna step back. I'm gonna say it says bank load form scraper callback. So it's not a web scraper. Bank load
Scraping
Scraping like credentials, like when you try to log into your bank account.
So if you ever deal with point of sales, what they do is they call the point of sales malware most of the time. What they call them scrapers. So what happens is it's malware and it sits in the box, and what it does is it goes through and it scrapes memory for certain like banking forms. So it looks for like certain keywords in like pretty much memory, like credit card or CCE or something like that. That would usually signal like credit cards being stored in memory before it's put in the database. So what it's doing is just looking for certain keyword words that represent like banking information in RAM.
So, sorry, I was thinking like a developer and scraping.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's one of those. Yeah, it's an interesting like slang term. So
Well, but it's also a horrifying way that developers actually make two applications communicate. They'll just scrape data off of each other's apps.
I've been there, man. I worked with some AS400 developers one time. That was the way they did stuff. Was they scraped green screens, but neither here nor there. So let's go and let's jump down to the email one. So you got like a sender address, which I blotted out, and a recipient. But like, what are some things you can do there? Mouse spam. What are some ways I can pivot or kind of understand what's going on there? All I've given you is like 2 email addresses, a timestamp, and like the IP address that it was sent from.
Pivot off the timestamp and see if you get any other alerts like this one at the same time.
All right, you don't really get anything. Put it off the timestamp.
That's like 2 years old. You might as well just move on to another order.
Well, listen. I've never been so trolled so much.
The trolling is strong today. It's glorious.
So let's pretend that was yesterday.
We're back in 2016.
Look at the sender address. Does the sender address look like some legitimate address, but it's got a different letter here?
Okay, well, what are some other attributes of an email that I can look at?
Domain name.
SPF, that's another one.
Didn't pass the SPF.
What are some other things though? Think more user, like how a user interacts with it. Like you send an email to do what? Communicate.
And total or attachments.
Attachments, stuff like that. So like if I can check and see maybe if it has an attachment.
Look
Or-
at bite size on the email. That's a fantastic way to filter and like make attachments together.
Or if I get a copy of the email and it's got a URL in it, where can I go from that?
Click on it, right?
Dude.
It goes straight to Cuckoo Sandbox.
That gives you a whole new range of DNS and IP addresses to hunt on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just seeing rabbit holes, thousands and thousands of rabbit holes to dive down.
Yeah, so like the big thing is like you have to keep in mind, it's like once again, you have to be able to think about how things are interconnected. And that's why pivoting is considered a skill. Like it's something that you go in day one and I give you like an alert. And if you've never worked in a SOC before, you're gonna be like, oh my God, how do I do this? Like, where am I gonna? But it's one of those things that most of the time they're gonna feed you the fire. You're gonna have someone that you're gonna saddle ride with that can kind of give you some hints and stuff like that. But being able to piece together like what is an actual email? An email is a sender or recipient. There are mail headers, so SPF, DKIM, all that good stuff in there. There's a body. You're sending the email to communicate with someone, so there's a body. There's a subject line. There's attachments. So like the other thing is like most of the time with like phishing emails, they send them all with the same subject lines. So once you confirm that it's a phishing email, you can usually search that subject line and say, okay, these other 60 users got it. They're all terrible people because they didn't report it to me. Or I could say it's got this URL in there, and like these other people are terrible because they didn't report it to me, and they all clicked on it.
I'll say this, in my experience, and I've got limited experience, I'll admit, I've only been with a couple of companies that have been in a security chair. Once you've been through 18 months of heavy training on this and like continually reinforcing that it needs to be something they pay attention to, my experience is a lot of that goes away. Like you can train users out of just mindlessly clicking it. If they do click it, because that does happen.
I said you've never worked for the state.
I spent 9 years working in the state, and I beat my users into submission.
The problem with
We've got some strong users.
yeah, I was about to say the big problem with phishing is it's easy to train users on like pretty much like the generic like phishing, like, hey, I'm from Nigeria and I need you to.
Right.
But like if it's targeting phishing, like if I'm spear phishing or I'm whaling and stuff like that, that is very, very hard. I have a buddy of mine who actually works like incident response, and he was in Florida, and they actually had a situation where they were actually trying to get into like a financial company, and it's kind of gray on what actually happened. But the adversary actually went and sent an email to like the CEO of this financial company, and the school district that his children went to, that they were able to find out, didn't have an SPF record, DKIM, or anything like that. So they spoofed the superintendent of the district and actually said, like, hey, there was a bomb threat at the school. We found the bomb. We've evacuated all the people. We've attached this PDF file going into details with our release.
Tell where your children are.
And it's one of those things. It's one of those things that he got that. His heart dropped. He clicked on that PDF that had JavaScript in it. And
Click.
Game over. So stuff like that. So once again, you can beat.
I mean, honestly, you could probably phrase it. Your kid is attached.
So yeah, you can literally like train users for that low level stuff, but when it gets targeting and they're actually doing research and stuff like that, this stuff is very, very manipulative. In fact, at one point in time, like some of our Russian troll friends back during the election were actually targeting people with like some malware. I want to say like Symantec actually released like a little blurb about this on Facebook, and they were like, "Oh, you like Hillary Clinton? This is why Hillary Clinton is stupid. Click here and click this link." And they click there, click that link, malware. They do the same thing with like Trump fans, like, "Oh, click here." And they pretty much were like spreading malware that way. That's another common way. If you say something that just infuriates someone or just gets that emotional response, most of the time they don't think, they're just going to click. It's the same way that we're seeing a lot now with like people like oh, I'm an elite hacker. I installed malware on your machine. I went to all these porn sites, pay me like 1 Bitcoin to like this Bitcoin. They really haven't done anything. They're just trying to scare you. But people fall for it. Like you can actually go and you can, there are ways to track like payments with like Bitcoins to Bitcoin wallets. So you can actually see who people are actually paying people. Like it's just one of those things. If you can elicit an emotional like response, most of the time people are going to fall for it and click on it. But that's pretty much all I have. If you guys are interested in like I guess more like technical stuff or actually working through like actual real like in-depth like events at some point in time, I can put together another presentation maybe. I mean,
I feel like that's a ripe opportunity for an actual like workshop where we have people bring in laptops and actually work through log data or packet captures or what have you.
Like I said, I'm fine with that. If that's something everyone's interested in. Like Security Onion is free. I got tons of packet captures we can replay through that just generates tons of noises. I got a buddy who like used to stand up like whole honeypot environments, like domain controllers and stuff like that, and like let people breach them. And I've got packet captures from that. And you like see like crazy Brazilian people like putting like all kind of like weird videos out and like posting and creating like one of the interesting things that they did one time was they compromised the network they got in. They got to his DC and like they started making users like Princess Leia and stuff like that. They might have known it was a honeypot, I don't know, but it's just kind of interesting some of the data sometimes. But no, that's really all I got for tonight. That's all I got. Thanks for those of you. I know it looks like some people went home early because I think it's late. Sorry, I got long-winded. But I hope you all enjoyed it. I guess I'm done. So if you guys want to
Mr.
lower the
Poole,
gavel.
thank you as always.
Yes.
Thank you very much for an entertaining presentation and for hiring a troll to be your presentation. Hey, Infinite Portals. So, ladies and gentlemen who are still with us, if you are interested in continuing the fun, I think we're going to head down to